This is episode 445 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Wally, today is October 11th. It is also the very start of early voting here in the state of New Mexico. Folks so inclined across the state of New Mexico in each of the 33 counties of the state, so far as I know, can go down to their county clerk's office and vote early for the 2022 November election.
Early good, often illegal. So
Yes.
keep that in mind.
Not often, just please vote just once. And early voting, as we more traditionally understand it with the various locations, is kicking off on the 22nd, which is a Saturday. Something that I want to spend some time going through here is ballot questions and initiatives beyond some of the hot button issues, things that you will confront on your ballot that you may not be as informed on. You know, I do know that our listenership is. I often say that if you want to be among the 0.01 percentage New Mexico informed citizen, tune into this podcast and you will be in that elite category. But I also get, and often around this time of year, folks call me out of the blue and say, "Hey, Paul, I don't know about X, Y, and Z judge or this issue that is on my ballot. What are your thoughts?" And I'm happy to offer my thoughts as best as I can in a nonpartisan, albeit conservative, limited government approach. But it's also a great opportunity here. So get out your pen and paper, folks, if you would like to find out more about some of the issues that are not getting as much attention in the media and the advertising campaigns, etc., as others. So we're going to start with judges, and this is the one that always kills me because
Yeah, you know what, Paul? Of many things that are broken electorally, I think the judge election system is the most in that. You alluded to it, but yes, constantly people they have one or two approaches. I either vote yes for every judge or no for every judge, and there's very few people that actually are able to discern whether they ought to be voting for these judge retentions or not.
yeah, it's a convoluted process to say the very least, and it's something that quite frankly, if I had my druthers, it would be on the very top of my agenda in order to reform it and really try to get a better system in place. And before we dive into these judges and the election, it really is it's something that is counterintuitive to the point where it actually is probably unpopular. Because we always hear, I'm sick of, partisan infighting. I don't like, the partisan advertising, the partisan this, the partisan that. Pretty much partisan is like the F-bomb, which we don't say on this podcast. We can say partisan, but we are nonpartisan. And, it's something that we very much value, although the IRS does tell us we have to be nonpartisan. So there is that. But I would love to see a system where judges run in a partisan race, because it's not a dirty word. It's not a bad word. Having a label next to your name, whether it's R, whether it's D, whether it's L for libertarian, whether it's G for green, or Constitution Party, you actually have some information there about what that individual stands for. Now, we know And we are under no illusions that this is a blue state. But in my humble opinion, after 16 and a half years of observing New Mexico politics, the best way to give one party dominance to an election system is to remove party labels, thereby essentially making everybody a Democrat. It just where there is no party label, there is no accountability, and it automatically falls to you're just electing Democrats to all these various positions.
Well, and that's until recently that was definitely the case with the Albuquerque City Council. They don't have a D or an R in front of their name. Notwithstanding that fact, everybody knows what they are, and they keep score according to that. So
exactly,
it reminds me a little bit, Paul, of the very young youth leagues. Oh, we don't keep score, and it's like, well, maybe you don't, but everybody watching the game keeps score.
Mom's over there with her towel.
Exactly.
Well, my kids scored 5 runs and driven in 3. I think had a good game. Yeah,
exactly.
All right, so without further ado, let's dive into some of these judges. So I will further add that with all the crime issues, especially here in the Albuquerque metro area, there are multiple, success has 1,000 fathers while failure is an orphan. In this case, failure has 1,000 fathers and mothers. There are many people to blame for the state and the city's crime issues, but one of the most obvious ways that voters can say, no, we're sick and tired of the situation with crime is to change their votes where they can on the judges. And the Supreme Court of New Mexico has 4 out of its 5 members, which are appointed by Michelle Lujan Grisham. Mm-hmm. The only one who is not appointed by Michelle Lujan Grisham is Michael Vigil. He comes in the judicial retention portion of your ballot, which if you vote to retain, that means that he essentially becomes kind of a fixture there in the Supreme Court. If he is not retained, then the next governor, whoever that is, gets to nominate somebody else, and there's a future retention election, et cetera. But the critical thing is, for this and all other retention elections, you have to get 57%. You're not running. This is the classic, self-motivation. You're not running against anybody else. You're running against yourself. You're achieving that 57%. Now, Vigil is a fine man, but he is a part of the establishment approach to the judiciary. He is someone on the Supreme Court, and if you want to see a change, that's the way you've got to vote. So I, generally speaking, recommend non-retention for all judges, because if New Mexico's crime was really low, if things were going swimmingly, I would say, yeah, let's retain the judges because things are going great. If you think things are going great, especially on the issue of crime in the judiciary, you're smoking something more than the legal marijuana that the governor brought for us. So that's retention. Then you've got justices of the Supreme Court that are on the ballot. You have 2 Republicans, Thomas Montoya and Carrie Morris, who are trying for that against Julie Vargas and Brianna Zamora. Those 2 are in direct elections against each other. So you have 2 different kinds of election for the Supreme Court on the same ballot. Very confusing. We had Liberty on the Rocks last night. I had Barbara Johnson, a Republican who is in a partisan election for the appeals court. She's one of 2 Republicans trying to get on the appeals court, Gertrude Lee being the other. There's not just a Democrat in both of those races, there's also libertarians in both of those races, but they are those are the judicial races. So appeals court being a step below the state Supreme Court, although equally important. Those are the main judicial races. Here in Bernalillo County, there's a bunch of unchallenged judges for Metro Court and the like, probate court, etc. you're really not given, in district court, you're not given much of a choice because the way the system works. So you either fill in the dot or you don't fill in the dot. It doesn't really matter because all they need is one vote from one person, probably themselves, to get back to the court.
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter. There's unchallenged elections. So let's go with the judges first. Wally, any comments there?
Well, Paul, you talked about failure having many mothers and fathers in New Mexico, and correct me if I'm wrong. To control crime, you need to arrest, prosecute, convict, sentence, and then require the serving of time. And it's one of those we have a lot of issues here in New Mexico with all of those things. And so, you know, I'm not easily overwhelmed, but it's one of those things that's like it's very difficult for me to say, here's what I would do. And it's one of those I tend to fall into the frustrated vote against everyone. But then you point out on the Supreme Court we have a retain election at the same time we have new elections. It reminds me a little bit, and believe me, sorry for any listeners younger than about 60. It reminds me of the old pinball games where you have one pinball, but then there's this thing that's called multi-ball, where it's like there's all kinds of stuff going on there. So it just makes it very difficult to figure out what the right thing to do is. And so I don't have a real, I guess, strategic, here's how I look at it. But I do know that from an issue point of view, one of the issues also in New Mexico is with our business climate in the state, I don't know, this is a technical legal term I'm going to use. The squirreliness of our Supreme Court is also one of the things that's a hindrance to people wanting to do business in New Mexico. There's so many interesting, and by interesting, I mean bad cases that they rule, particularly in employment law and other things, that it just makes it another one of those things about, hey, do I really want to do business in New Mexico where we're not sure what the law is, how it's going to be interpreted, and how it's going to be ruled upon. So I guess I am now convinced, Paul. I will do a lot. I mean, I do every time I do review the judges, but it's very tough, and there's a lot riding. And I think the Supreme Court's a good place that if you're only going to put some effort into figuring out on the judges, those are the ones that are probably the most impactful.
Yeah, judges have a wide variety of impacts. Obviously, crime is the hot button issue that everybody is talking about, but we constantly also wind up on lists of judicial hellholes and the like.
Yeah.
New Mexico's judiciary is widely known as being biased in favor of plaintiffs, biased against folks who, are on the side of business and on the side of judicial restraint. And hey, maybe you shouldn't have done X, Y, and Z before you have a huge payout from the bar, legal attorneys. I've often said that some of the nicest private buildings in at least the city of Albuquerque are those of the so-called ambulance chasing attorney types. And you also see the sheer number of advertising campaigns. Partially that is driven by the easy opportunities they have. If you build it, they will come, so to speak. If you have a lenient judicial system that is inclined towards big payouts, you will have lots of those so-called ambulance chasers darken your doorstep. And this is the way things go in New Mexico and have gone for a long time. So I will, ranked in level of importance, judges are right up there with some of the other people and issues that you face on your ballot. However, amending the Constitution of the state of New Mexico is a critical issue, and you will have 3 different amendments to the Constitution that will be voted on. These are also very important, although, polling shows that Amendment 1, this is the pre-K issue, and we've talked about this, that New Mexicans are inclined to take the payout, take the money from the land grant permanent fund, and place it into early childhood and other government programs. And we talked about the flaws in the system and why these permanent funds are not very effective and efficient ways to use government money. The accountability is simply not there. And whatever time period you pick, 5 years, 10 years, could be more. We're going to be back in the same place unless someone comes in the electoral process, a governor and legislature, and dramatically overhauls our education system, adding pre-K on to the broken education system that we already have in this state is unlikely to move the needle on educational results.
Yeah, and then Paul, and it is interesting. This is one of those issues and there are a lot of these in politics where it just sounds right. It just sounds right. Early childhood education is one of the most important things that we can do for our children. It will do all of these positives and no negatives. The data just isn't there, though. You've had lots of guests on the podcast talk about this over the years, and that's assuming that it's done well. It still doesn't have the massive impact that is purported. But it's one of those things. If you're not, you have to be a hyper educated voter to even know that there's some controversy with that. The average person on the street is like, is this a good thing or a bad thing? Oh, it's a good thing. That is the default place. And so whether, it's one of those, I don't think this is a good idea, particularly as a constitutional amendment because of how hard it is to undo. And, heaven forbid we find out that it's not working in the future, and then it would be very, very difficult to undo. And then by then, we have a huge bureaucracy, a lot of union teachers and other care or service providers, and it becomes very difficult to undo. So I maybe have tipped my preferences towards that one, but it's one of those. If I were betting on it, have you seen polling on any of these? By the way, is there any out there?
It was close to 2/3 support.
Yeah, that's sort of what I would guess. Unfortunately, so
yeah, and again, because of the dynamic of the permanent fund, which is set aside for for savings, for future use, for investment. This looks like you have a bird in the hand versus a bird in the bush kind of situation. Are you going to take the money and spend it right now to quote unquote help New Mexico kids, or are you just going to keep this money locked away and invest it for the future? And this is one of the things that the Rio Grande Foundation really splits from folks typically in the Republican Party. And I get it, because the Republicans' mindset is Democrats control everything, therefore they're going to waste that money when they tap into the permanent fund. And they're not wrong on that, but you can't politically win an argument when one side says, hey, we have a proposal, and the other side says, we don't have a proposal, we're just going to keep that money. I mean, we have over $20 billion in this land grant permanent fund. It's a massive pot of money available. And it's just something that was built on flawed logic from the days of the Constitution of the state of New Mexico, where they said, well, the oil and gas is going to run out. And
it is 500 years from now. It's probably going to run out.
Someday it will run out.
Yeah.
But we're nowhere near that date, and we just keep generating more and more money off of it. And the likelihood is that regardless of whether you tap that permanent fund, history has shown that fund will likely continue to grow in size. We continue to grow the oil and gas industry, and oil and gas, for all the attacks the environmentalists make on it, continues to be the major source of energy in the United States and the world, and it continues to become more and more important. I know that's a separate issue from pre-K. We've also looked at, of course, the impacts of those actual programs. The best study available from Tennessee highlights the fact that when you have a control group, that control group actually outperforms people, young children who were put into these pre-K programs, 3 and 4 year olds. If you're a parent, as I am, think of the setting preferable for a 3 and 4 year old, not an academic setting, not a classroom setting. Those kids should be at home with mom or dad, and really learning and growing within, not to be mushy, the love of their family, not in an institutional setting with a paid teacher and a bunch of other kids. There's nothing wrong with pre-K as a institution, but it should be geared around play and just experiencing, interacting with other children, not not some kind of academically driven program. And just it's not a very good use of our funds, and building that into the Constitution, giving a direct line into that permanent fund is going to only reduce whatever accountability would exist. And we have spent much more as a state on pre-K and early childhood programs, starting with Susana Martinez, who got very little credit for doing so. But even during tough budgetary times, she massively increased those programs. And that was something we disagreed with her about, but it is what it is. So that's Amendment 1. Amendment 2 is the one that I actually think people should focus the most attention on, because I think it's got the better likelihood of being stopped, which is to allow taxpayer dollars to be used for all kinds of infrastructure projects for the private benefit of people in New Mexico. And by private benefit, I mean that we have an anti-donation clause which prohibits the direct donation of cash or money to private interests in the state of New Mexico. This goes back to the founding of the state and the Constitution prohibiting the legislature from giving away large tracts of land and money to the railroads, who are a big economic player. In the early 1900s, this would theoretically, the idea is to help impoverished New Mexicans gain access to water and have paved roads and have broadband access. But there's nothing stopping government from encouraging these kinds of things. There's just a prohibition on actually government hooking up and creating these systems. And the idea of government owned and operated broadband and government owned and operated roads
or even
on private land.
Yeah, or even not owned and operated, paid for but operated by the private sector, probably even worse. It's like it's nice work if you can get it on the receiving side, but is that really is that anything other than a recipe for waste, fraud, and abuse? I mean, it just seems like that. I don't know, that this does not seem like a good idea. And this one's interesting. I'm with you. I think this one, the voter might say, this maybe isn't the best idea.
Yeah, there was a pro Amendment 2 opinion piece in the Albuquerque Journal this morning. It wasn't very convincing in my estimation, but I sincerely hope that voters take a closer look at that. Amendment 3 would require that an appointed judge be up for election at the first general election 1 year after being appointed. That's instead of being up at the first general election after being appointed. I think this has a potential negative impact. We should have accountability right away for those judges, rather than allowing them to sit on the bench being appointed. It doesn't solve by any stretch the imagination. It actually takes us, I think, in an opposite direction of where we need to go with our judicial process. But I would say that Amendment 1 is a definite no, Amendment 2 is a definite no, and Amendment 3 seems to be a probable no. So that one I think there's a little more discretion on, because the judicial election system is so broken in this state as to be only one of many problems there.
Yeah, and conceptually, Paul, I think the earlier accountability, the better. But by the same token, I'm just thinking of the case as somebody is appointed basically the month before or in a timely enough period to put them on the general election ballot.
Mm.
And you haven't even heard a case yet. And now the voters are supposed to say, are you doing a good job or not at the other end? And so that just is another example of, I don't know, what do they call that? Goofy season in terms of the New Mexico judiciary election and retention process.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. Now we've talked to and had discussions about Secretary of State, AG, Governor, Congress, but I do want to highlight a few issues in some of the down ballot races. These are listed higher on your ballot, but they're kind of below the radar. Auditor, that's somebody who looks at the books of the state of New Mexico and makes sure that, to an extent, there's an accountability there. Interestingly enough, Joseph Maestas, the Democrat, is running not against a Republican, but Travis Sanchez, a Libertarian only. So when it comes to Republicans and the Libertarian Party, it's they giveth and they taketh away. Of course, Bedoni is causing some heartburn for Mark Ronchetti and his campaign. One I definitely want to highlight is the treasurer's race, Harry Montoya versus Laura Montoya. Harry being the Republican, Laura being the Democrat.
Montoya will win.
Yes,
we're pretty sure of that.
Guarantee that one. Take that one to the bank. But we've had conversations on this podcast, and I would encourage folks to go to tippingpointnm.com and just use the three letters ESG. Because Tim Eichenberg, a Democrat, is a conservative, somebody who believes in a lot of the same principles as we do at the Rio Grande Foundation, which is kind of rare in today's Democratic Party. This treasurer's race would definitely change that. Laura Montoya is not of the Eichenberg ilk. She's not a kind of a hands-off or a moderate voice there in the treasurer's office. Harry Montoya, I've tried to get him up to speed on what ESG is and why it's an issue for New Mexico's state treasurer and other treasurers across the country. ESG is environmental social governance. It's something that really allows people in some of these big investment houses and politically oriented folks to say, no, you should not invest those dollars on behalf of the best return and best on the fiduciary responsibility of the state of New Mexico. You should only do it on these green or somehow socially significant causes. And I think that could be an issue down the road, depending on who we elect in the treasurer's office. Public lands is one of those races that I have heartburn about, just the very existence. It's kind of like the permanent fund thing writ large, because, of course, what is the mission of the Public Lands Commissioner? To maximize our oil and gas and other revenues, primarily oil and gas, and dump that into the public school system. Yay! So I know you probably have some thoughts about Public Lands Commissioner.
Well, I do, yeah. And, one of the thoughts I have is that, their goal is to maximize revenue from state trust lands. And notwithstanding the fact that that is their job constitutionally, there have been many land commissioners that have done a suboptimal job of that. They, many land commissioners ago, and I won't mention names just because it's ancient history. But the idea is this land commissioner said, and this was in front of a legislative committee. Someday the state land revenue from wind and solar is going to eclipse oil and gas, and it's like, and that is right. 10, 20, 30,000 years from now in the future, it probably will at the current rate. But, a lot of our...
Maybe.
Yeah, to tie the two concepts together, ESG and the State Land Commissioner, if you proceed from really what are false premises, that oil and gas is something that can easily be gotten rid of and still have a functioning society, and that wind and solar and batteries are going to take over, without destroying our economy, our country, hurting the poor, everything else. It's easy to go along some of these paths. But if the plans as they're currently formulated are executed, it ain't going to be pretty. And I think everyone really knows that. I think even the farthest left environmentalist knows that, but they just don't care. But they're not about to tell the truth about how ugly and painful it's going to get. But we're already seeing in Europe. When you run out of fossil fuels, particularly in the short run, it could be a cold, mighty cold winter. And when your electric prices quadruple, what it does to your citizenry is not pretty. And, New Mexico and the United States is doing our darndest to try to follow in those footsteps. So,
Yeah, and that race is between Stephanie Garcia Richard
the incumbent.
and Jefferson Byrd. So he's a former, current PRC commissioner. So that is the Commissioner of Public Lands here in Bernalillo County. We have Paul Pacheco running for sheriff against Democrat John D. Allen, Pacheco being a Republican. You have a libertarian in that race as well. Then you have, you have bonds. I vote against all bonds. I'll just make that pitch because, especially here in Bernalillo County, voters have a tendency to automatically knee-jerkily embrace all bonds. I think that is a unwise approach to voting on bonds. It doesn't mean that I automatically oppose all the bonds. It just means that it would be nice to have voters be skeptical about them every now and again. And then there is a charter amendment for Bernalillo County, which, interestingly enough, the details of the charter amendment are not very clear from the websites, from the actual ballot. So it's one of those things where, remember sick leave? There was controversy of whether they could fit it all in because it was such a long ballot measure. Well, I being skeptical, trust but verify, Bernalillo County, I wanted to make 100% sure that this was not a issue that had some very deep-seated policy implications. The charter amendment for Bernalillo County, again, you won't have this if you're not in Bernalillo County, but it is the most populated county in the state. The hiring process for the chief of fire and rescue is streamlined so that the position becomes a direct hire by the county manager instead of undergoing county commission confirmation. A few other even more minor changes, nothing that I am going to raise a stink about one way or the other. So that is the county charter amendment, and that's pretty much it for the election. As it sits across the state of New Mexico, there may be some local issues that we don't have knowledge of, but that's just the reality of this being a state with a lot of different counties, a lot of different issues on the ballot. I hope we've helped you think about some of the issues on your ballot this fall.
Yeah, and then Paul, you talked about the bond issue. Let me give you my approach, and if you think it's crazy and I shouldn't have said it, I will accept that. And but here's what I do: is the bonds almost always pass. No matter what they are, they almost always pass. Now, a big exception was APS had a bond issue that they just really did a horrendous job of. And so my thought is, I always vote no against them. And then anything that goes down to defeat, guess what they do? They explain what it is. They justify it as opposed to just, put out $20 million for to purchase library stuff. You know what I mean? That they'll go and do that if any of these go down to defeat, because the level of information about a lot of these is very, very meager on the get-go. But boy, if they get defeated, they'll come back with a lot of information to make sure that we're all informed voters so we know why it's so important. So,
yeah. I just, like I said, vote against them all. The APS was not a bond election in the same sense that At least if you're talking about the same one I'm talking about, they had a tax increase
Well, no,
that
it's yeah,
was
yeah, exactly. So no, you are exactly right about that. But the same idea is
right,
you just say just throw it in there. We always get them. It was a mill levy,
right.
which is guess what? Mill levies are basically just the increase your property taxes to pay for stuff. Bonds are kind of this issue issue debt and then pay for it with various sources of income that come in. They're all a form of tax and borrow, tax and spend, borrow, tax and spend. But yeah, you're right. It technically wasn't a bond issue, but when bond issues go down anywhere in the state, you get a lot better accountability and information for
Yeah, and
that.
it's I'm giving it short shrift, but it's not just that I don't like bonds. It's because bonds are, while they will say you're not going to raise your taxes by voting yes on the bond,
You're not going to lower it
you're not going to
either.
lower it, and ultimately those bonds are paid back through taxes paid by we the people, whatever jurisdiction is taking out the bond. I mean, it literally is a debt instrument that you will be paying back for whatever period of time the bond is in effect for. And again, it's not that every single thing that's done with those bonds is somehow problematic. It's just that it is an unfortunate trend, and it's not just like a 1 or 2 year trend. We're talking about a multi-decadal trend of voters, at least here in Bernalillo County, just blindly voting yes every single time a bond comes up. And I remember if it was last election or 2 years ago, where the ART bus system had just been constructed, total and abject failure at all levels of city government, and the transit agencies are asking for more money. Of course, these are the same transit agencies that are now offering quote unquote free buses, but they can't maintain public safety on those buses. And so there's a huge discussion and controversy around that. So it's government likes to spend your money, and sometimes it's good if you just say, no, I'm not going to go along with this particular one for whatever reason. All
Yeah,
right.
yeah, and then one real quick
Yep.
thing: we have higher interest rates now, so
There you go.
bond
Yeah.
interest rates will be higher, and then you have to look at the real versus the nominal interest rate. But there's a lot more uncertainty in the bond market than we've seen in terms of what it may cost the taxpayer compared to the last couple of decades when inflation was well controlled.
All right. We're going to look quickly at Allied van lines data, the trend in 2021. This is really something that's neat in the last decade or so, where companies like United Van Lines and Allied Van Lines crunch the numbers and show where people are moving to and from across the country. 2021, of course, still being kind of we're in the thick of COVID year, so very impactful there. And not surprisingly, all of the states where people move to would be red states. All of the states where people move from in high numbers were blue states. Two included Arizona, Texas, Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Florida. Uh, Three of those states being no personal income tax states, in addition to being more conservative red states all across the board. Blue states that lost people: California, Illinois, Michigan, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Maryland. Uh, it's pretty straightforward. I think the other interesting thing is they analyzed specifically California, and found that in 2021, California had the second highest outbound. They were the second highest outbound rate state. So 66% of moving involving California were outbound. 2/3, of course, for the uninitiated. California has been in the top 10 outbound states for the last 5 years, according to Allied Van Lines. LA was the fifth top outbound city of the entire country. Where are Californians moving to? Perhaps even more interesting. And, maybe sometime this is worth really parsing out, although I think this is fascinating research. How do Californians impact the voting climate of the places they move to? But notably, Seattle, Washington, Dallas, Texas, Houston, Austin, and Phoenix are the top 5 cities that Californians move to. 4 of the 5 being zero income tax jurisdictions, Seattle and then the 3 Texas cities, Phoenix being a non-zero tax state or area, but very low income tax, very pro free market, although a state that is kind of in that purple category nowadays. Not surprising that Californians aren't coming to New Mexico in as large of numbers. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, or somewhere in between, is certainly an open question. We certainly have a fair number of Californians out there, and I, for one, welcome our Californian overlords. To quote the Simpsons, I'm not anti-California in the sense that I think people who, maybe not all, but maybe on the margin, some majority of people who leave California do understand. They have a basic concept that the policies that California has been implementing for decades have failed miserably, and they are the reason that those people are leaving. I'm not saying everybody moving out of California gets it, but I do have some basic level of faith there. So any thoughts on the Allied Van Lines report there?
Well, as has been the case for a long time, New Mexico is not a destination of choice leaving these other states. They definitely stop in Arizona and then keep going, either flying over or driving through on I-40 to Arizona, and that has not changed.
Excellent points. And finally, New Mexico Democrats are talking seriously about raising taxes in January. I don't need to tell you that that is a bad idea. Certainly, when you talk about this particular tax issue, it's narrowly targeted. It would be a kind of a sin tax situation on alcohol. New Mexico is in the middle of the pack when it comes to our taxation of alcohol. However, not a surprise, we have the highest percent of alcohol deaths in the country, according to KRQE and some recent studies that were done. 34 deaths per 100,000 people, which apparently puts us at the very worst in the entire nation. Now, this has led some in the Democratic Party in the legislature to say, we're going to raise taxes. That's our solution. Because, of course, basic supply and demand, Wally, if you tax something high enough, you reduce demand for it. Although that is a very blunt instrument and one that could do great harm to our economy. Because while no state, well, let's put it this way. Michelle Lujan Grisham definitely views marijuana legalization as an economic driver. The question is, does she see alcohol sales as being in a similar vein of driving our economy? I don't know, but the point is that there are ways to address the ills associated with alcoholism that don't necessarily involve one-size-fits-all punishment of everybody who drinks a beer or a glass of wine or has a bourbon at the end of the day.
Yeah, and Paul, there was a huge public policy piece about New Mexico's alcohol issues that led to this legislation, and it's I in no way saying this was in any way disingenuous, but it was obvious that this was laying the groundwork for some legislative activity. It was really obvious when it came out what it says, and yeah, its solution is raise taxes on alcohol. That will help. And it's one of those things is that alcohol is a very interesting problem. And what is the biblical quote about the rain falls on the just and the unjust? And so if we're going to try to help those that are alcohol abusers, we're going to tax everybody. So the guy that wants to buy a 6-pack and have a beer in the evening, he's got to pay more for that beer because somebody else has an alcohol addiction problem. And I just don't know. It just doesn't seem. It just seemed like this is an interesting one. And then you brought up an interesting point. Which of these is the favorite drug of choice among New Mexico government? Alcohol? No. Marijuana? Yes. Cigarettes? Oh my God, cigarettes are horrible. So it's one of those things. Marijuana is like we maybe need to raise alcohol taxes to subsidize marijuana at the rate we're going in New Mexico. But we finally got some reform in terms of looking at tourism and the restaurant industry being able to afford liquor licenses and other things. And now they're like, okay, let's just tax everybody, and that's going to make it better. I think this is, it hurts the working people in a time when we have a lot of challenges and inflation in the economy. And as you say, Paul, if you need brain surgery, you would like your surgeon to not have boxing gloves on. This is a blunt tool that there's got to be something better that can be done than that to help address alcohol problems in New Mexico. Because where does this go? This is the start. We already tried prohibition as a country. That didn't work.
Right.
Now we support marijuana. It just seems like we are all over the place. And I'm not sure that, saying that alcohol is now the problem child in New Mexico is good. So,
Well, with a $2.5 billion budget, it would seem hard to justify raising even the tax on alcohol because of that. Now, if there were to be some studies of why New Mexico has these serious issues, if it's some cultural thing, if it has to do with poverty and idleness, hint, hint, workforce participation, I think that would be an interesting thing to carefully look at and study. But the idea that you're just going to say, well, we have problems with alcohol in the state of New Mexico, so we're going to increase taxes on everyone. I would only say one more thing, which is that New Mexico actually gives a tax break to microbrews and the breweries that make the beers that are most associated with New Mexico, Marble and Bosque and other Ex Novo, a lot of great breweries here in the Bernalillo County area around the state. Are those the beers that are being abused? I suspect not. I suspect that it's probably not even beer that's being abused. I suspect it's other things. It would seem that is a baseline for starting your studies to actually solve this problem and not just try to tax our way to stopping people of all stripes from drinking, which would have serious ramifications down the road. So,
yeah, and it just strikes me, Paul, one final thought of what I call the bad teacher approach to discipline,
Yep.
which was, the teacher lectures the entire class when everyone knows what the problem is. It's like let's talk to the people that are having the problem, not just make it everybody's problem when it's far from that. And Paul, I am not unsympathetic to the ravages of alcohol abuse in New Mexico or anywhere else. But yeah, it just seems like this is what we're going to try. But man, it's a cumbersome thing to approach the problem with.
yeah, and I'm not saying this is on the ballot, but it is certainly something that indirectly you are voting on based on up the ballot issues with the governor and the legislature. So keep that in mind, folks. All right. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube and Rumble channels. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.